It's the 13th of April 2026, and this interview is being conducted online in the UK. My name is Tola Sargeant. I'm the CEO of Archives of IT, and I'm joined today by Catherine Mason, historian of computer and digital art, author, and curator. Catherine is a historian of computer and digital art who has spent over 20 years recovering and documenting Britain's pioneering role in early digital art. Her research at Birkbeck College led to two books, A Computer in the Art Room in 2008 and the MIT Press Collection White Heat Cold Logic in 2009, and to the donation of major archives to the Victoria and Albert Museum. Her most recent book, Creative Simulations, published by Springer in 2024, focuses on George Mallen and the founding of the Computer Art Society, including the Eco Game of 1970, which was the first multiplayer digitally driven interactive simulation in the UK. She continues to write, lecture, and engage with the current AI art debate. Welcome, Catherine. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I thought before we get into the story of your career and your research, which is a fascinating area, we should start by talking a little bit about your early life and how it all began. So it looks like you had quite an international upbringing, born in Australia, raised in the US. Yeah. So what brought you to the UK, and how did that sort of growing up across the three different countries shape your perspective?
Well, my parents were expats, so they were living in Australia. They met in Australia, and that's why I was born there. But they moved around quite a bit. My father was English, a Londoner by birth, and my mother American. And my father was a scientist, so he gave me an opportunity to see the world in a questioning way. He was into biology. He ran the Seattle Science Center in Washington State for a while. And at that museum, there was some of the moon landing stuff, equipment from Apollo missions. So I was really, I guess my early interest was sparked by being able to sit inside the moon landing module that they had in this Seattle Science Center. So, and my sister and I, we had little sticks of moon food, that was things that you could eat, like peanut butter out of a tube. And so all that kind of thing was, I had that growing up, which was lovely. And then my father, being English, decided to come back to the UK in the late 80s. So that's when I came to Britain permanently, although I'd been traveling a lot throughout Europe as a child. And so I studied history of art, and I started working in the art world when I was 19 for a West End art dealer. So yeah, it was I've been a lot of years in the art world.
What drew you to art history particularly for your studies?
Well, I really liked art always. I used to hang out in the art room at school. I wasn't very academic, and I went to schools that weren't particularly academic. So, I just kind of hung out in the art room. And then when it became clear that I wasn't going to be an actual artist myself, I thought, well, I'll do the next best thing, which is art history. And I was hoping that, that I could speak to artists. And in fact, that's kind of what I've ended up doing. But I guess really, I thought that this would be a good way to try and get some clues as to why the world is the way it is. And I thought that art gave us a glimpse into what humanity is capable of doing, and why. I didn't really know there was such a thing as psychiatry at that time. I probably would have gone into that if I'd known. But for me, everyone in my family are either artists or scientists. They're in the humanities or they're in the sciences. So it was easy for me to go into art. When I was 19, I never believed that I would be doing so much science or technology alongside it. So that's been something very unexpected.
Well, it's an unusual combination. I mean, before we get onto that, perhaps you can say a little bit more about what it was like with that first job working with the art dealer in Mayfair. I mean, what did that teach you at that time, just 19 years old?
So it was a steep learning curve, but I loved London, and at that time London was very central in the art world, and people still physically visited commercial galleries a lot. So yeah, I guess I kind of learned how what the commercial world is about, selling, and it's completely different from the public sector. So later on in my career, I was very interested to work in more public sector and academic environments. So I'm fortunate that I've had both experiences. So yeah, it's been very fascinating.
A good grounding for you.
Jeez,
How
yeah.
how did you end up then going into the sort of the computing art side of it? That the first project in 2022, sorry, 2002, I think, with Birkbeck. How did that come about, and what was it all about?
Well, when I started out doing the history of art, and this was the late 80s, like 1989, it was basically sculpture, painting, and architecture,
Mhm.
three subjects. And just to give you an idea, in 4 years of the degree, we had one class on photography. So there really was very little discussion of contemporary movements in art and technology.
Mm.
However, they did emphasize strongly the use of techniques in art. So, and I was very lucky at Birkbeck at that time. We had Francis Ames Lewis, Peter Draper, and Will Vaughan, who are kind of famous names in the art history world from that era. Sadly, retired and passed away now. But anybody who had that kind of who was at art history at that time had this kind of general grounding, where they taught a system of compare and contrast. So how you learn is by comparing this item to that item, the difference between this item and that item, and what is that difference.
Mhm.
So this was a very traditional art history upbringing, is what I'm trying to say, which was what the discipline was like at the time. We just were starting with feminism in history of art was just coming in. Something that was called the social context of art was coming in, and these things, of course, are now completely integrated within art history. But even though it's not that long ago, the late 80s, early 90s, it was still very traditional. So and I went away and I did various things, and then I taught for many years in art education, adult education. And I had a company with a friend of mine. We did PR for art galleries and put on little exhibitions in the West End, that kind of thing. Worked a lot with artists who wanted to do their own exhibition organization and not go through a dealer. In those days, you could hire galleries quite inexpensively and you could put on little exhibitions. You could do pop ups at fairs, this kind of thing. So we did a lot of that. And then I decided to go back to Birkbeck in 2002 as part of this project, the Cash Project. And this was specifically about recovering the British history of digital art. And the reason for this was because many other countries, well, many, certainly Germany and the US, were starting to write their own histories of digital art. And of course, the UK would have, been written out of that. So this was a project put together by some great names now, people like Paul Brown, um, Charlie Gear, even Ernest Edmonds was involved, I believe, George Mallon, to the point where they got a bid together, and at that time, the Cash Project had was in receipt of the um, greatest amount of funding that the AHRB, the Art and Humanities Research Board, at that time it was still a board, had ever given. So that was 100,000, which was an unheard of amount um, in arts, academic arts, but also for the fact that this was looking into the origins of digital art. So it was quite groundbreaking at that time. Um, and subsequently, of course, the AHRC became a council equivalent to the Science Research Council, and went on and funded lots of things at much more greater depth. But at that time, it was quite groundbreaking. So Birkbeck had a history of being involved with some technology. They had worked on the National Gallery uh, uh, it had a name. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was a sort of a early multimedia in database that was located in the gallery where you could look up works of art and find out some things. So again, very early multimedia use. So for me, when I joined, I joined alongside Nick Lambert, who produced, I believe I'm correct in saying, the very first PhD on this subject at Oxford under Martin Kemp. So we were really quite a close-knit team. And we had Paul Brown, who of course is a pioneering artist in A-life and artificial life agents in his art. So we were really tasked with just trying to find the scope of what this field was, because it had never been historicized properly before. So for me, it was a very steep learning curve because I didn't know really very much about technology, computing technology at all at that time. I had heard of John Lansdowne, and he was one of the original founders of the Computer Arts Society back in 1968. And in fact, his death was a kind of impetus for this project. So he had a lot of archives. And it turned out that other people had archives too, including the Computer Arts Society themselves, had lots of material, catalogs, artworks, two-dimensional works on paper, plotter drawings, and so on, that they had collected over the years. And of course, George Mallon was still around, Alan Sutcliffe still around at that time, the other two founders of the Computer Arts Society. So we gradually gathered together all of this material, and we sort of scoped out what the parameters of the field were. And we kind of discovered that if you take into account Roy Ascott and his early cybernetic stuff, which was really groundbreaking in the mid 60s, and then working with people like Stephen Willits, one of the pioneers of conceptual art, that it kind of started around the mid 60s, and it kind of we decided to stop at around 1979, 1980. And this was really just because we decided that we had to have a cutoff date. We couldn't just carry on forever. And it was around that time that more user-friendly systems were coming into play. So there was a bit more WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get on the screen. Paint programs were kind of more very well established at that time. So artists no longer had to kind of write their own code or actually build their own hardware or make adjustments to existing systems so that they could be used for art making. So that kind of seemed like a good cutoff date. And the reason it was called CACH, C-A-C-H small e, was really a pun. So it was, CACH stands for Computer, Art, Context, Histories, etc. And cache itself, of course, can mean, like a cache of memories or of documents or of great wealth. And at the same time, it's also a term that's used in computing to talk about memory and storage and so on. So it was a kind of a fun name that my colleague Nick Lambert came up with. So we had this project for 3 years, and that's really how I started talking to all of these pioneers in Britain. I feel very fortunate to have recorded a lot of their stories for the first time. And that is in the book Computer in the Art Room. Things like, for example, Tony Pritchett, who was the first animator in Britain to make a animated film. And his name ought to be as well known as, I don't know, Steve Jobs or something, but because this field has been overlooked historically in the UK, his name is just not known. And I remember, Tony was a lovely fellow, and I remember asking him, tell me about the Flexipede, which was this first film, and it was shown at Cybernetic Serendipity and many times throughout the 70s. And he said, "Oh well, this is how I did it, and this is the story." And I thought, okay, now I'm making notes, but I thought I'll just ask him where else, where else is this, what books are you in? Because I thought I'll go away and I'll look some more stuff up. And it turns out that no, he said that he wasn't. It's not anywhere, and the reason is because no one had ever asked him before. And I thought that's really astonishing, that by rights, this should be a household name. The person did the first computer animated film. I mean, he worked at the Atlas Lab in Rutherford, on the Atlas computer, and I think there's something like 3 minutes of film, and it took him the best part of a year to produce this little black and
Wow.
white film. It's now on YouTube, so you can look it up. It's called the Flexipede, and it's just a marvelous example of British ingenuity, really. So I learned how to. I mean, I had this skill previously, but I really kind of finessed my skills of speaking with artists, finding out what makes them tick, why did they do things, how did they do it, and it's always occurred to me that one of the reasons is that the art world has overlooked this for certainly for so long, and certainly in the early part of my career, was because people just didn't understand it. But then I would think, well, I don't really understand oil painting either. I mean, you can look at a Vermeer and you can appreciate that there's layers and layers of glazes, thin glazes built up in oil paint on a support. But I've never actually done it. And I think it would be very hard to reproduce that today. But that doesn't mean that you can't appreciate, understand, and enjoy work like that. But for many people in the art world, they had no idea about computing. A lot of people of my generation, and it was just, oh, it's too hard. I don't want to admit that I don't know anything. So therefore, I'm just going to discount it or actually be downright rude about it. And I've collected many stories over the years of people telling me how they were ignored by, even people within their art schools or people outside, people in galleries. They just couldn't really, it just didn't seem to resonate. And I think part of that is because they don't understand the technology behind it. I'm not saying that I understand it either. I don't, but I'm very willing to ask the question. And if you ask, people are surprisingly willing to demonstrate and show you how it works. So,
Mm.
I mean,
Do you
it's nothing really special. I just ask, and they tell me, and I write it down. That's basically what I do. I like to put things in a historical context, but there's no real secret to it.
do you need to understand the technology behind it in order to appreciate it, do you think?
On one level, no, but on another,
Mm,
yes, because what I'm looking for when I'm looking at any type of art, of any genre, of any age, is how has this artist or this person, this practitioner making art? They don't necessarily need to be an artist in the traditional sense of an art school trained, and this goes for outsider art. How has this person pushed the technology, whatever materials or methods that they are using? What have they done with it that is surprising, that is different, that pushes the boundaries, that tells us something about the nature of the material, but also the nature of the human brain that is conceiving it and is executing it? So that's really what I'm looking for. And you can go on to different levels. On the one level, you can just admire this and say it's lovely and bask in the beauty of it, for example. You can be horrified and appalled by and repelled by the subject matter if the artist is trying to maybe tell you something shocking about contemporary life. Um, but then on another level, I think if you can understand something about the materials and methods that were used in making, the processes that the artists went through, the systems that they're subscribing to, or not, as the case may be,
mm.
then it really tells you a lot more about. I'm going back to that whole thing, when I was 19, what makes humanity tick? Why are we here? What is the point? What is going on? What is the meaning of life? I'm not expecting to get an answer, but if I could get a little couple of clues, it would be nice.
I mean, when you look, I had done some research, and to actually see what they managed to achieve in the 60s and 70s with computers as they were then, I mean, I find quite incredible from a sort of technical perspective. Were there any of those interviews that you did through the Cash program that sort of particularly stuck with you, or any particular insights that you did manage to glean from talking to the various computer artists?
Well, yes, and the overriding message from that time really is how difficult it was, and that it was a
Mm,
niche. So, if you think of art as already really a niche, I mean, we're enmeshed in the art world, and we think it's everything. But actually, for the vast majority of the population globally, art is a niche. So here we're talking about a niche of a niche. These are a very small number of people who did this at this time because it was difficult and it demanded long hours and dedication. It wasn't something that was necessarily taught as a standard subject in schools. So that meant that, you had to kind of go out on a limb already. You had to be an outlier by definition. And it actually attracted a certain type of mindset, a type of person who was interested in logic, who was interested in mathematics, who was interested in perhaps underlying laws of the universe, discovering what these are, and how can we set up a system to make art. According to a set of rules or a set of instructions. And that's an algorithm, of course. So that is writing your own algorithms, writing your own code, trying to decipher, like Harold Cohen did, how can I distill everything that I know about being a painter into a system, into a set of rules that will paint for me, so to speak, get the computer to produce work of its autonomously. So this attracts a certain type of artist. Of course, there's other types of artists who are interested in different things. So that really the art world is a vast and huge umbrella that encompasses a lot of different types of approaches. But yes, I think that it was a small world back then, and most people, they had heard of each other or they knew of each other. So unlike now, where it's enormous and there's simply no way we can keep up. I mean, particularly with social media and so many artists who are bypassing the gallery system these days. They go straight to the purchasers, to the buyers. They can go straight to their audience without having to go through dealers, without having to go through layers of museums and curators and whatnot. So it's just impossible to keep up with nowadays. It's so huge. But back in the 70s, it was very possible to know of, if not know personally, every single person involved in the field. And they would get together and they would have, they'd get together at conferences, they'd get together at meetings, they'd get together at exhibitions. When somebody traveled from the States or from Japan, they would come to the UK, they would make contact with the Computer Arts Society, with Alan Sutcliffe particularly, and they'd all gather around and have a meeting and discuss things. This is obviously way before the internet was a usable interface, and the way you learnt things was through conferences. It was through proceedings, books, articles, and by talking to people.
I mean, is that part of what you hoped to? That's the story that you wanted to tell with a computer in the art room in 2008 to make sure those messages weren't lost and that history was preserved.
Absolutely, and I do understand that what I'm doing is very close to oral history and social history. But that doesn't bother me in any way. I don't see why I can't, talk about Tony Pritchett and his experiences, or talk about Alan Kitching, who told me the lovely story, which didn't make it into the book because I didn't feel that it was academic enough. But Alan Kitching also worked at Didcot at the Atlas Lab, and of course he was an animator, and he had to work at night because this is when the machines were not required for their normal usage, scientific simulations that they were being put to. So he would obviously go in there in the evening, and he would spend all night letting his program run. And he would get very tired. And one day I think regularly, he would lie down and sleep on one of the desks, one of the tables in the big computer room. These are big mainframe computers. They were in their own specialist facility that was air conditioned. And, so anyway, he was lying there asleep, presumably on top of his desk. And the night watchman came by and saw this fellow stretched out and thought someone had died in there, and was just horrified, looking through the window. And then pretty soon Alan Kitching sits up because, of course, whatever time has come, and he has to go over and do something to the program. And the night watchman pretty much had a heart attack because here's this rising from the dead Lazarus. So that was lots of funny little stories like that. But when you have to go in at night, imagine going in at night and using the equipment, because they said, okay, you're an artist, but you're not important. You can just come at night when it's not needed. And of course, this stuff was really expensive. It was high tech, cutting edge, expensive. You couldn't just have any old buddy going in there and twiddling away with it. You had to have people who were in charge. And many artists, they actually had to build up a reputation, had to build up a relationship with these technical people who wore white lab coats, who were probably quite dour, probably quite, mathematically minded scientists. And here's a crazy artist in the 1970s who had some wacky ideas. You had to build up a relationship. Many times these people collaborated. So we see a lot of art being made both by people who are from an art school trained background, as well as people who are from a scientifically trained background, and people who are neither, who go in and use equipment and collaborate with others. So it does encompass a wide range of practitioners who maybe don't fit the traditional definition of what an artist is or what an artist is supposed to be. And again, this is another clue to me as to why it had been overlooked for so long by the art world, because the art world is not willing to accept people who do not fit a certain mold. So if you do not come out of a traditional art school background or something that fits what they consider to be a true artist, then you don't really count. So this has again been problematic and challenging for the mainstream art world to understand that people who are actually technicians or maybe have science degrees, they can also make art too because they were fascinated by what these machines could do. They were not designed to make art, but they could be used in a creative way. And of course, that is something that all artists have done since probably the first person put their hand on a cave wall and blew around it and left their handprint. The dawn of time, how can we take technology? How can we push it? How can we manipulate it? What can we do with this thing that we can use creatively? And that is something that runs through the whole of humanity. And it's nothing particularly new with computing technology. It's just that we happen to be in this era living through it. And of course, for some people, it has been challenging. But now I'm seeing that a lot of the younger generation are fascinated by technology and the history of computer art. And it's very gratifying to me to see that many people are becoming much more interested in this history. I mean, when I started out, back in the early 2000s, nobody was interested at all, not interested in the
It was
slightest.
your
And
time, yeah.
nowadays, it's very much more popular, and digital art is booming.
Yeah, we'll come on to that in a minute. Just whilst I think about it, the names that you've mentioned so far have been male. Did you come across many female computer artists during your research? And if not, why not, do you think?
Well, yes. Although the early days in the early 2000s, this was specifically looking at the British experience, and it was overwhelmingly male. Having said that, there were women who made computer art in Britain, and some of them are detailed in the book. Um, and I did manage to track down quite a few of them, so that was great. Most of the women who we now think of today as being more famous in this field are American. So we've got Colette Bangert, Vera Molnar from France. Um, Ruth Levitt, who's also American. So there are more women. There are fewer of them in Britain, but I do put some in the book. There are some in the book. Of course, Yasha Reichardt. She was not a practitioner. She was not an artist, but she was a great exhibition organizer. And she, of course, is the one who put on Cybernetic Serendipity in 1968, which is a groundbreaking show that everyone remembers. And many of the pioneers that I interviewed went to visit or were exhibited in it. And she spent a great deal of time researching and looking into that field to put on that exhibition. So yes, there were women, not as many, and this is reflective of the fact that the computing industry itself at this time was overwhelmingly male in the 70s
Mm.
and late 60s as well. Although, having said that, there were women who were able to get involved. And then later on, you get people like Patrick Prince, whose husband worked for Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California, and she was able to get access to artists and people working creatively with these machines through him. So she became a great collector, and she did. She wrote for her master's thesis in art history. She wrote a treatise about the history of computer art, and she became involved with SIGGRAPH and curated a lot of exhibitions with SIGGRAPH. So there were women peripherally as well as those who actually made art. And subsequently, I've obviously branched out from more than just doing just the British, which was that first project was focused just on Britain. And I'm now pleased to report that I work with many great women artists. In fact, at the moment, I'm writing a piece about Darcy Gerbarg, who is a New York based artist who used early paint systems in the early 80s. So late 70s, early 80s. So there's a lot more still to be uncovered and to be explored in this field. It doesn't ever seem to you never seem to get to the end of it, which is nice.
Well, absolutely, particularly with the advent of AI, I should imagine. We'll again come on to that in a minute. You mentioned Patrick Prince, and I think you were instrumental in getting their collection donated to the V&A in London. I mean, how did that come about, and was that really quite a unusual move for the V&A at that time to take on?
Well, yes, it was unusual for art at all because this we're now talking, I suppose, about 2006, 2007. And Patrick Prince was, sadly, she's passed away now. She was a great Anglophile. She actually had a house in Britain, and she used to come over and visit a lot. And she had collected this vast collection, array of materials, everything from, Christmas cards written to her by artists like David M. And Robert Mallory, right up to catalogs and books that she had written herself, as well as a lot of actual art pieces, predominantly works on paper, plotter drawings, and so on. So she was looking for somewhere to donate this, and she was very keen for it to go to a British institution. And really, at that time, the V&A proved to be the best fit, partly because, I hate to say it, but the Tate was not interested at all at that time, nor any of the other museums that the Cash project attempted to liaise with. So the V&A, however, had a very forward-thinking curator at that time, Douglas Dodds, who has subsequently retired. But he was involved in a department called the Word and Image Department, which again has been renamed and transformed into something else. But it was part of the Libraries and the Prints and Drawings Department. So it kind of fit nicely because computer art you could almost think of as being like a type of language, words, and of
Mhm.
course you get an image.
Yeah.
So it fit very nicely in with their remit. They are able to obviously accession flat items, two-dimensional items more easily than sculptural items, books, ephemera, all that sort of stuff. So she donated it actually via the American Friends of the V&A, and it came into the V&A. And they did have one or two small items. They had a print portfolio from Cybernetic Serendipity, which somebody had purchased back in 1968. So they were able to add this to their tiny little collection already. And really, it helped to form the basis of what became quite a well-known and now particularly a very well-known and highly regarded digital art collection there. And this was like a nucleus, and other things started to other people wanted to donate things, artists wanted to donate things. Subsequently, the archives of the Computer Arts Society went in as well. So they really became the place to go for quite a few years. It wasn't until much later that museums started collecting this stuff.
Mm. How does the sort of the preservation of computer art work, given that technologies moves on so quickly? How do you try and conserve that art when that technology is no longer accessible potentially? Are there issues that you've managed to explore there?
Well, I would not say that I'm an expert on conservation by any means. I'm more of a writer, and I like to sort of think I'm a kind of a public face for this, and I like to put some historical context around it. But having said that, I do know that there are a lot of challenges with plotter drawings, works that have been produced on paper that is able to very easily damaged by light, for example. So, the V&A took on board a lot of the conservation that was required, particularly from the Computer Arts Society collection, which had been kept all together and stored in a dry place, but it was in quite a dusty condition a lot of this. So there was certainly cleaning and a little bit of preservation that went on there. You cannot put too much of these early works, particularly from the 60s and the early 70s, out on view too regularly,
Mm.
because the light, the paper was the early type of computer paper, which just gets deteriorated. Like fax paper nowadays is completely,
Whatever was on it.
so some of these things, they can't be, they need to be on rotation,
Mm.
um, so that they don't get too much light. Now, with regards to works that are more perhaps born digital and live digitally, the issues there are things like emulation. So you need to transfer things from one medium to another, but then you need to ask the question, what is lost when you're doing the transferring? And is the work still, how close to the artist's original concept is it? I mean, this is something that the art world has had for a long time. I mean, you think of light works that use light bulbs and light fittings from the 60s that are no longer made, so this is a real problem that, in fact, there are some projects internationally that are specialists in this subject. um, but yeah, it's certainly something to consider. I mean, even in my own career, I can see technology like little discs and things that no longer, I can't really play very well.
Mm. Yeah.
So, but then there's a whole group of people out there. You can ask Facebook, and say, "Does anybody know how to play this?" And somebody will say, "Oh yeah, I've got that machine," And so
Mhm.
there's a kind of a subculture of kind of geeky people, and I include myself in that, who like to kind of tinker about with this stuff and see how it can be replayed or recreated or emulated or migrated from one system to another. But I think it's always important to remember that there are issues when you do this. But so
Yeah.
long as, I suppose, you contextualize it as well as you can, then I would say,
Right.
for if you're helping it for a new audience. I mean, Tony Pritchett's Flexipede film that we mentioned was on 16 millimeter
Mhm.
reel tape. And somebody, well, in fact, I transferred that to DVD, and somebody has now put that onto YouTube, which is
Yeah.
in another form. So
Mm.
it's not the same as when it was shown at Cybernetic Serendipity, when it was actually run through a projector and projected onto a screen. But nonetheless, it means that people can see it and they can enjoy it and they can learn
Yeah.
from it.
Lives on. Mm. You mentioned the Computer Arts Society a number of times, and I gather you were instrumental in reforming that. I mean, what is its role today, and how has that evolved over the years?
Well, it was originally started in 1968. It came out of cybernetic serendipity. People like Alan Sutcliffe and George Mallon and John Lansdowne, who had seen cybernetic serendipity, thought how wonderful it was, and that they ought to gather together people who have a like mind and an interest in this type of technology. And again, pre-internet, it's very difficult to find out about this stuff. So you had to kind of speak to people. You had to learn from somebody. So they produced a bulletin called Page, which has been digitized. All the PDFs are online now at the Computer Arts Society website. You can just Google that. Um, and this talked a lot about the entire field, and a lot of debates. Oh, everything from what should it be called? Because some people did not like being called a computer artist, and they wanted a different name. So some people didn't want to be associated with the organization, but they would come together maybe at exhibitions or conferences, and they kind of knew of each other, and they were a support network as well. And they also offered opportunities to learn how to code. They had workshops, coding workshops. They had a tiny bit of funding that they could actually fund a few works of art occasionally, which happened. Um, and then they kind of ran out of steam. So they were going very well throughout the 1970s, and into the early 80s. They kind of ran out of steam. Dominic Borum, computer artist from Slade, was the last editor of Page in about, I think, the mid to late 80s. And he actually got some Arts Council funding to help with that, which was really interesting at that time. Anyway, he kind of retired, and so it kind of petered out. So when the Cash Project came along, people like Alan Sutcliffe, and indeed George Mallon, were very interested and indeed Yasha Reichardt was a great inspiration, always great inspiration for Kaz. Said, look, let's restart it because there's some interest in this now, and indeed there has been. And so I joined the committee, and I've been on the committee ever since. And today, we are small. We don't have a lot of funding. We are still a part of the British Computer Society, which is the Chartered Institute for IT here in Britain. So what we are able to achieve is naturally limited, but we are still a focus, I think, for people who are interested in this field, not just the history, but contemporarily. And we have a wide range of members. I mean, members is a very loose term. It's just anybody who wants to, join the Facebook group, anybody who wants to join the email list, anybody who wants to come along to one of our talks. We try and do everything. Most things we try and do very, very cheaply or free. Most things are in fact free. And, we have put on little tiny exhibitions at the headquarters of the British Computer Society in London Moorgate. And we have members who are interested in AI, and we've got members who are interested in robotics, and members who are interested in history, and members who are interested in interactivity. So it's kind of a nice a group. People join from all over the world. So yeah, it's still going strong today, which is lovely.
Excellent. And if we move forwards a little bit, you talked about the eco game of 1970, which sounds quite remarkable. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about that, and what happened to that work and those ideas?
Well, yes, the Eco Game was a Computer Arts Society project, and it was led by George Mellon, who had a company at that time called System Simulation. And George Mellon was really interested in cybernetics. He was a physics graduate, and he got his PhD in behavioralism and cybernetics. So he was the best place to lead this project, but it involved about 25 members of the Computer Arts Society. And it was commissioned by a trade body, a computer trade body, and they were having a trade fair. So I mentioned that this work had not really been accepted by the art world. Well, it certainly wasn't in 69, 70 either. So the Computer Arts Society members found that the trade body, the trade organizations who were trying to sell computing technology, were actually quite supportive. So they went along to the Computer 70 um, uh, trade show, which at that time was at Olympia exhibition halls in London, which is now gone, by the way. But anyway, it was there at the time, and the trade body said, "We will commission you to make a centerpiece for the exhibition." So this is what became Eco Game, and the idea was that it would show the cutting edge use of technology, but what artists could do with it, what it could be done, what it could be pushed towards in terms of simulation, in terms of interaction, participation. So they were very interested at that time, the Computer Arts Society people, in uh, behavioral characteristics and how could computing enhance decision making and um, add towards the for the benefit of humanity. So the piece was quite utopian in outlook, which is something that I think we find hard to conceive of today because we're much more critical of our technology, and we talk about the big tech companies and big data, and we're very critical of that. But having said that, at that time, it was the belief was still the post World War II belief that progress would lead humanity towards something positive, and that computing, which of course had been developed along lines for warfare, maybe you could transform that into something that was more positive. Could we use this as a benefit for humankind? So this is what the eco game was about, and the term gives you its name, gives you its clue. So eco stood for economics, and it stood for ecology. So it had to do with the environment, what we've now called the environmental movement, and it had to do with economics, in other words, how the economic system works, and differential between different economic groups and how money is distributed throughout society. It had a basis in competition and cooperation. So, people sat around using the latest technology, and you can look up. I've written several things that are freely available, as well as the book, which is unfortunately behind a paywall, but is downloadable from several universities, by the way, now. But basically, people made decisions according to a set of questions. And the decisions, depending on what their answers were, images flashed above on screens. So it was circular in its first, in fact, it took place inside a dome in its first iteration at the trade fair in 1970. And you would get images showing a prosperous society, maybe children playing, in the street. If the economic model was well balanced. So everyone was given a pot of resources and they would draw on these resources and you could allocate your resources to different areas. And of course, what people learned, it's actually quite difficult to allocate resources. It's actually quite difficult to work within a system, within a model of the economic banking balance that we have. In other words, so it was kind of educating people as to that, but also showing them how they could have some agency. Doing X, Y, and Z, by making these decisions, you could get to a prosperous, healthy society. Or by making bad decisions that were maybe poor for the Commonwealth, maybe better for your own wealth, but not so good for everybody else's wealth, meant that you would get of Victorian slums and people living in poverty. So it was a way of kind of using simulation through computing to it seems very simple to us nowadays because we have extremely sophisticated tools, but it was a way for people who had never interacted with this stuff for them to understand, yes, I do have I have a place in this society. And George Mallon was very careful to point out that he used an economic model of like a capitalist society, but you could use any model. The fundamental basis of it could be replicated, and that's what was so beautiful about it. The way that it was set up, it could be used for any kind of simulation. And of course, while these people were participating in this, producing various cost benefits in this economic model, they were also having an art experience because they were involved in the production of imagery. So and the slides, they were 35 millimeter glass mounted slides, and Kodak carousel projectors. They could access these images almost immediately. So this is where the computing came up. So depending on what your answers were, it would pop up a certain slide instantly. So you were able to see the state play at any given time. So people could stand around and watch as well as participate. So it became a kind of spectator thing, and a theatrical spectacle, they called it as well. So it was really something that was quite groundbreaking at the time. Having said that, they used the technology that they had available to its utmost. They pushed it to its utmost point. And that is what made it groundbreaking. So yes, it was not so much ahead of its time as very much of its time, in that they used what they had, but they pushed it to try and tell people something about life and the way that capitalism works. Now, subsequently, it went on to be shown at the World Economic Forum. George Mallon was invited by the first convener of that forum to bring it to the exhibition in Davos, which it did. That was 1971. And it was seen by Stafford Beer, who was a very well-known cybernetician, post-war cybernetician. And he actually used some of its technology in his project CyberSyn, which was a proposal that he did for the government in Chile, who were looking at trying to make a decision room. And again, this has been documented. Project CyberSyn, you can look it up. CYBSYN, cyber, CYBERSYN, CyberSyn. And unfortunately, that never was built because there was a government upheaval in Chile, and so that project was canned, unfortunately. However, he did recognize that it would be of great use for people in decision making and education, as well as a way for people to kind of understand something that is quite difficult to comprehend otherwise. And so I think this is why at Davos it went down so well. 35 millimeter slide, of which there are 700, have been saved by George Mallon's family, and they are now with the Computer Arts Archive, which is an initiative of the Computer Arts Society. So, and there are people working on this, and we're hoping that someday it might be recreated or emulated, perhaps in a digital fashion. But it's kind of its ideas, I suppose, they were sort of, it was lost, and partly this because there was no momentum to carry it forward. Because, of course, nowadays we would see this as a great piece of interactive participatory art, and it would be put on view in an exhibition or museum. But at that time, it just there was no momentum for that. So, having been shown in Davos in '71, that was the end of it.
Oh, it would be amazing if you could bring it back to life and yeah, get it displayed today.
Yeah, there are people who are very interested in doing this. So, including Sean Clark, who's our current chair of the Computer Arts Society. So we'll see.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I'll just briefly then, if we come forward to the present and AI, generative AI in particular, I mean that's a huge area, and I know one that you are also interested in. Could you maybe just sort of summarize your view on where we are and where you see computer art going in the future as well? I think that would be really interesting for our audience.
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? I mean, there are a lot more players now, obviously. So I mentioned that, and it's very hard to keep up with everything. There's so much being produced, and I think the generative stuff that we get nowadays, falls into different categories. There are some very good artists who are interested in using this in a new and innovative way, and then there's a lot of other stuff which I think has been termed AI slop recently. That is just stuff that's just churned out, and it's rubbish. So I guess you can't really tell what's going to survive the test of time until the future unfolds. So it's easy for us to look back and say, oh well, it's this or it's that. But when we're living in it, it's quite difficult. So I guess time will tell. The other point, though, that we have to bear in mind with is how the art world works nowadays. And of course, it's still driven. Obviously, we're in a capitalist system. It's still driven by money. So those people who tend to shout the loudest, get the most publicity. They're the ones who tend to get written about. They're the ones who tend to make it into the history books, and they're the ones who tend to get remembered in the future. That's not necessarily to say that they're the best. They were the ones that got that shouted the loudest. So that is the failure of the system, if you like, that we're in at the moment. But having said that, it also gives artists a great opportunity to bypass that whole dealer gallery network system and say, I'm just going to go straight to the collectors. I can mint NFTs. I can do things myself, which is wonderful. You can reach audiences that were unheard of before, so that's also wonderful. So there's downsides. There's also plus sides. What's going to stand the test of time? I hate to make predictions, but in my latest book with George Mallon, looking mostly at the eco game and the early days of the Computer Arts Society, I did bring a few little contemporary pieces in. I talk about Sasha Stiles, who's someone I really admire, who is a poet and a visual poet as well, uses text and very interesting use of AI there. Someone else, Krista Kim, who is also using AI in an interesting way to make environments that respond to the person. They use one of her works uses your own heartbeat to create visuals, which is, kind of again a way of trying to make visible something that is normally invisible, which is a good use of digital technology, but also creates beautiful visuals and is unique to every single participant. So yeah, those are just a couple of names. There's obviously lots more I could name who I admire today. To remember where this stuff comes from, I'm always interested in the history of something. What is the history of this? Where did it come from? Who bought it? Why was it made like this? Who's funding it? And once you start to ask those questions and not just use it in as a just kind of very casual manner, then I think you're starting to get to grips more with the nature of the beast, and you can make some more interesting choices. So it's those people who are using it in a really kind of a more considered way, I think, who I'm most interested in. But I'm very inspired by the younger generation. The people who make the AI art magazine are doing great stuff with this. They're on their third issue coming out very shortly, and I've been fortunate to write for them for all 3 issues. I do a little piece about history. So, it just gives some context, and maybe there's something we can learn. I think there's things we can learn from history. So I mean, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it's certainly there's echoes, and there's references to history. And a lot of younger artists that I see nowadays, they seem to be just redoing the same thing. And I'm like, well, yes, these issues were explored in the 1960s, so perhaps you could look to history. You could consider that. That was a time of great transitional change, the post-war period. So maybe now that we're in a time of great transitional change, some of those ideas might be relevant for us today. So this is why I always
Mm,
advocate history and the learning of.
absolutely. We would certainly agree with you there. One final question, if I may. As you know, our audience does include sort of younger generation, children at school, or those just starting out in their career. Is there any particular advice you would give maybe a young computer artist or a young art historian who wanted to work in the space today, or a related space perhaps?
Well, yes, my gosh, it's getting a bit crowded. I have to say, the art world has got oversupply at the moment, and we are in a bit of a slump. These things are cyclical, and so things go up and down. The art world is in a little bit of a slump at the moment. So we're hoping that maybe there might be some more movement in an upward trajectory. But yeah, we are oversupplied at the moment with art. Having said that, there's always room for new ideas, and I would always encourage people to read as much as they can, learn about as many different subjects and as many different things as you can, because you never really stop learning. And you can always ask people. The only way that I've ever learned is by asking people. My father used to play this game called 20 questions. And, you had literally 20 questions in which to try and ascertain what it was that he was thinking of. And there was another game that we used to play as children called animal, vegetable, or mineral, and it had to fall into one of these three categories. Was it an animal? Is it a vegetable? Is it a mineral? So I think that's a really fun game to play with young people. I mean, nowadays we think, what is AI? Is it vegetable?
Good
Is it
question.
mineral? Is it a combination of the two? I don't think it's an animal yet, but it might be one day. These are very worrying. So, I mean, my father didn't know about AI. We didn't have that back in those days. But yeah, maybe we might have to put animal, vegetable, mineral, something else. I don't know. But yeah, just continue to ask questions and speak to as many people as you can. And don't be too narrow-minded in your outlook. I tend to approach things with, if I can, and I'm not saying that this is easy and I don't always get it right, but I try and approach things with an open heart, and I try and say, I'm willing to give something and maybe the other person's willing to meet me halfway. And so far, touch wood, this has proven to be, successful for me. So I would really encourage anyone to approach the same way. Don't be closed-minded. You never know what's out there.
Be open to opportunities and stay curious. But
Absolutely.
fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for sharing your insights and your story with us today. An unusual area for us to look at, but really fascinating and very complementary to the other stories within Archives of IT. So thank you
Brilliant.
again.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.